فأدب مع الله علا وجل بأن تلازم الحياء والذل منكسرا تحت الحياء وخاضعا تحت المهابة إليه ضارعا.
بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. وبعد, to continue inshallah with Bidayatul Hidayah by Imam Al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala. And we previously took the introduction to part 1, في الطاعات, the obedience, and he was discussing what obedience is and how a person will be able to engage in the acts of obedience. And we mentioned, because now the Imam is going to go into some of the chapters or subcategories, and he's going to go into some of the adab, the etiquettes and the mannerisms that a person should apply when worshipping, and the various areas that a person needs to understand in order to worship. And he referred to these things as the outward acts of piety, of taqwa. So what we are going to do is we are going to take the title of each and perhaps briefly discuss them, but we are not going to go into detail, and we might take a few things from some of the details that Imam Al-Ghazali mentions, as we will not be able to go into detail in every single section of the book. And this is something that can be referred to later on, inshallah, by those that would like more detail or more insight into what Imam Al-Ghazali has mentioned. So we stopped last week wherein he said that you need to be able to monitor your hearts and your heart and your limbs in order to apply yourself to the acts of obedience that he details. So now he goes into the adab. He says فصل في آداب الاستيقاظ من النوم. So he's talking now about the etiquette of waking from sleep. And he mentioned previously that a person should have an understanding of the acts of worship and the obligatory, the voluntary acts of worship from the moment that they wake up until the moment they sleep. And this pertains to the acts which are compulsory and obligatory upon every single person, as well as the acts and the compulsory and the voluntary acts upon a person according to their particular circumstance. So as an example, a person who is a trades person, or a person who is a nurse or a doctor, they will have to have understanding of certain things which are not relevant to others, but at the same time they will all have the shared responsibility of understanding the salah, for example, tahara, etc. Why? Because those things are relevant to all, regardless of the circumstance. So he says فصل في آداب الاستيقاظ فإذا استيقظت من النوم فاجتهد أن تستيقظ قبل طلوع الفجر وليكن أول ما يجري على قلبك ولسانك ذكر الله تعالى. So he starts by saying the first thing that you should do when you wake up is to make sure that you start your day with the dhikr, the mention of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you should try your best to wake up before the rising of Fajr, so that you can utilize that time for some worship, some dhikr, and you are ready for the entrance of the Fajr prayer. And of course, when you wake up, you are immediately going to want to prepare yourself for your worship. And so he goes into Babu Adabi Dukhul al-Khala, the etiquettes of entering into the bathroom. And here usually the fuqaha in the books of fiqh, they will mention the rulings which pertain to using the bathroom and the relieving oneself, etc., and how to do it according to the principles of Islam. And he mentioned some of the etiquettes in relation to that. So we're not going to go into too much detail here, but just generally speaking, a person should understand the etiquettes in relation to performing wudu and ghusl, etc., in regards to using the toilet, so relieving oneself, and a person should try their best not to use too much water and to preserve as much water as possible. Be moderate in application of the water, brushing the teeth, using the miswak, using a toothbrush and toothpaste in replacement of the miswak is fine, inshallah. If a person does have miswak, then bi'idhnillah they will receive more reward from using the miswak, if that's their intention that it is because of it's a sunnah done by the Prophet ﷺ. Some of the scholars, they mention that anything which cleans your teeth will give you the same reward, and you will be rewarded in accordance to the cleanliness of your teeth. And on this point, cleanliness is a very important part of Islam. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, "At-tahuru shatrul iman," that purification is half of iman. And some of the fuqaha, they mention that, i.e., it means purification for salah, or it means purification of the self, etc. But purification generally is very, very important in Islam. Cleanliness is very important in Islam, and there are places that we should make sure we are paying special attention to: our bodies, our clothing, and the places within which we will pray. And this is usually discussed in the books of fiqh. Then he goes on to adab al-wudu, the etiquettes of performing wudu, and he basically mentions some du'as, some supplications that can be made whilst performing the wudu. And of course, the most famous of which is starting with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, or Bismillah, and there are other variations of starting with the Basmalah that have been detailed by the fuqaha in their books. But what is most important here is to try to make sure that we are conscious of our wudu whilst we are performing it, so that we don't miss any areas out, number one. Number two, so that it is an act of worship and not merely a habitual practice. And if we want to make sure that our acts are acts of ritual practice rather than habitual practice, we need to make sure that we have some concentration and some consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's presence whilst performing those acts of worship. We're going to briefly skim through these sections. Then he goes to adabul ghusli min al-janabah, how a person will perform the ritual bath for being in a state of major ritual impurity. And again, this is detailed in the books of fiqh. And as we said previously, a person should try to study at least a textbook that covers all of the chapters of fiqh, according to one of the four schools of fiqh, the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, or Hanafi. Then he goes on to adab al-khuruji, adab al-tayammumi. So he discusses the replacement for wudu if a person doesn't have the ability to perform ablution due to sickness, or due to a lack of water, or due to fear that if they use the water it could potentially lead to sickness, or and of course a qualified fear, not the fear of a person who has, they're naturally anxious, or their fear is unqualified, or if a person is fearful that if they were to go to they were set out to acquire the water, it would lead to a harmful situation, etc. And again, this is discussed in the bab of tahara in the books of fiqh. But on this point, just a point to reflect upon, the scholars of the past and the people of the past, they would face situations wherein they did not have access to water all the time, and they would be very specific in their measurements of water because of the fact that they did not have abundance of water accessible to them. In our time today, we have free-flowing running water in the UK and in Europe, and in many parts of the world, including parts of the Middle East, etc., parts of Africa, parts of Southeast Asia. We have running, free-flowing water. We should be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this blessing, and we should take into consideration the fact that this was not the case for generations. We should not take this for granted, and we should try to be from the grateful. And today we face a sickness, which is that we are ungrateful, and we often look at what we don't have and we overlook what we do have. So being aware of this blessing and thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this blessing by utilizing the water in the ways which are pleasing to Him for purification purposes, and making sure that we do not waste water. It's very common nowadays to see that a person will buy a bottle of water, drink some of it and throw the rest away, or a person will drink some water and throw the rest in the sink, or a person will allow the tap to run for minutes on end whilst performing wudu, etc. We need to be very careful, because this is very, very dangerous, as our blessings can easily be taken away from us if we are not grateful for them. and perhaps even a point of reflection as we are now in a state of going into lockdowns and out of lockdowns, etc., for the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. Perhaps this is the consequences, or this is the consequence, of our lack of gratitude for the blessings that we took for granted. Perhaps we took for granted the blessings of our liberties and our freedoms, etc., and they have been taken away from us. We took for granted the blessings of our wealth and our health, and they were taken away from us. We have to be conscious of our blessings and thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the best way to do that is to remind ourselves of our blessings. Then he goes on to adab al-khuruji ila al-masjid, so the etiquettes of going to the masjid, the du'as to say, the state that a person should be in whilst on their way to the masjid. Then he goes to adabu dukhul al-masjid ila tulu' al-shamsi, entering the masjid and remaining in the masjid until the sunrise, until the sun rises after Fajr. And he mentions a lot of dua here, which would be beneficial for a person to refer back to and to contemplate over, as the duas that he mentions are duas that give you an insight into his way of thinking. And then he comes to a part which we're going to stop at briefly, as I think it's quite important, and it's a good way to try to organize our time. He says, وَلْتَكُنْ أَوْقَاتُكَ بَعْدَ الصَّلَاةِ إِلَى طُلُوعِ الشَّمْسِ مُوَزَّعَةً عَلى أَرْبَعِ وظائف، وظيفة في الدعوات، ووظيفة في الأذكار والتسبيحات تكررها في سبحة، ووظيفة في قراءة القرآن، ووظيفة في تفكر أو في التفكر. He says that you should have 4 areas that you try to focus on with your actions after Fajr until sunrise. And staying in the masjid between Fajr and sunrise, for those that can, is very important, as it's time with you and your Lord, and it's time to reflect, it's time to start your day in a positive way. And you find today many successful individuals, they talk about waking up early, etc., and how they find the most beneficial time is the early hours of the morning when everyone else is asleep. This has been our tradition for centuries upon centuries. And so we have more right to utilize that time than anyone else, as this was given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His prophets. So he says, after Fajr until sunrise, try to either spend your time in making dua, supplication, adhkar, and he says you can use, if you would like to, a subha, so the beads to count your tasbihat. And in our time today we have electronic counters. You can use your fingers if you feel more comfortable with that, but the point is to have a set amount of adhkar that you engage in every single day. The third is qira'at al-Qur'an, to read Qur'an, and the fourth is tafakkur, in contemplation. What should you contemplate about? Contemplate about your mistakes, your shortcomings, how you can rectify those mistakes and shortcomings, and contemplate about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His qudrah, His capabilities, and what you would like to achieve in your day. Then he goes on to mention آداب ما بعد طلوع الشمس إلى الزوال, the etiquettes of the time from طلوع الفجر, the sunrise, until midday. And he this I think we're going to stop at, and we're going to discuss inshallah slightly. So we're going to start from here, where we've skipped the part where he discusses the prayers that can be done between Tulu' al-Fajr until midday. To summarize, he mentions the duha prayer, etc. And again, these prayers have been detailed in these books of fiqh, but we want to focus on other areas with this book. So he says the first that you should use your time for between the sunrise and midday, after you have prayed your duha prayer, etc. And the most beneficial is talabul ilm al-nafi', to seek useful knowledge. So utilizing the morning period to seek knowledge. It might be for some people 10 minutes a day. It might be for others 20. It might be for others 30. It might be for some 2 or 3 hours. But having a period of that time wherein you seek useful knowledge is very important. And for those that have children, for example, your children have gone to school, or if they are being homeschooled or tutored, try to make time where you can study yourself, whether it's 20 minutes or 30 minutes, and dedicate yourself daily. If you cannot do it daily, then perhaps do it 2-3 times a week to studying and understanding Islam. It's very important. And today we are very, very willing to study for hours, various courses, degrees, qualifications. But when it comes to studying Islam, we tell ourselves that we don't have time. And we have to assess ourselves and that statement. Is that really the truth? Do we really not have time to study Islam? If we are honest and truthful with ourselves, we will find that we do have time. The time that we can have is the time that we need to make. And so dedicating ourselves to 30 minutes a day or 30 minutes 3 times a week is not something which is difficult. Then he says, the second thing to dedicate yourself to between sunrise and midday is worship. And he says, if you are unable to acquire useful knowledge, then the second best thing is worship. The third, he says, is to engage in good acts that will benefit other Muslims and bring happiness to them. So for example, going to help neighbors, going and engaging in community projects, helping the poor, helping the needy. It might be a form of communal activism, etc. The fourth, earning a living and protecting your deen. And today we have to, this is a part where we have to stop and contemplate or take into consideration contextualization. Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, he lived in a time wherein if you were to purchase land and to build a house upon your land, you did not have to worry about rent or tax or income. You could live off the land basically. And if you were able to acquire perhaps some animals, or you were to acquire a plot of land wherein you can grow fruits or vegetables, etc., you can feed yourself, your family, and potentially earn a living through such a life. In our time today, you cannot do that. In our time today, you have to have a means of income. You have to have a way in which you earn a living. And so a person may not have the time in the morning to study, and the time in the morning may be the time that they use to earn a living. Today we have traditionally 8-hour shifts, roughly, sometimes slightly less, sometimes slightly more. So a person should work around their work hours, their working hours, and working to earn a living and to provide for our families and to become self-sustaining is very important as a community. We should not be depending upon the welfare system or the government for our means of income. If we are in a situation where we do not have the ability to earn a living currently, perhaps a person has been made redundant, perhaps a person cannot find a job, perhaps a person is ill, etc. That's something which is completely different. But ultimately, our means of income should be from with our own hand. We should sow the seed of the tree that gives us our fruit. We should not accept to be given handouts unless we are in a state of needing those handouts. This is the way of the Muslim, the believer. The believing person is a person who aspires to be self-sufficient, especially for the men. As men, we should be proud to provide for our families. We should be proud to be earning an income which is sufficient for our families. We should not be happy to be in a state where we are depending upon others, or we are depending upon our wives. Perhaps in certain families, certain households, there is an agreement in place, etc. But those situations are circumstances which are individual. But generally speaking, our tradition, our heritage, the man provides, and this is something we should be proud of, and something that we should not let go of. And if we want to move forward as a community, and we want to move forward as a collective, we have to aspire towards being self-sufficient. A part of that which is very important and needs to be discussed, education. We are in a state now where we can determine our own career paths via education. Therefore, we should aspire towards the achievement of education, qualification, etc. And we should not simply be pleased to find whatever type of job we can. for the younger generations that were born and educated here, or generations that came over at a young age, they should utilize and take advantage of the vast systems of education that are in place in the West. And these are something which are a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and our right as we are Europeans, we are British, we are born and raised here, or came over at a young age and raised here, and we should see these as opportunities not only to educate our community, the Muslim community, no, but the larger collective. We should see these means of education as a means of attaining positions wherein we can have a good and positive influence on society based upon the principles given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the principles of goodness and purity. And this, if we look at the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ and the biographies of the prophets, is something which relates to calling others to Islam. The prophets came from noble lineages. They were known, their nobility was known. They were known in their societies as being from good families. Today, education is very similar to nobility. A person who has a high standard of education is accepted within society just as a noble person previously would have been accepted. If a person comes today to a discussion and they are qualified to the highest of standards, their opinion is qualified and is worth a lot more than the opinion of a person who maybe perhaps have understanding, maybe perhaps educated but not institutionally educated. So we need to take this into consideration, and we need to look at education as more than just a path towards a career. We need to look at education as a process. And if you look at our ummah and you look at our rise as a nation, you will find there's a link between our rise and education. And generally speaking, when you look at the rise of nations, you find there is a correlation between the rise of nations and education. When the standards of education are high, the achievements of that particular nation are high. When the standards of education are low, the achievements of that particular nation or community are low. So we should aspire towards setting ourselves high standards of education and achieving high standards of education, and we should not be pleased to be underachievers, nor should we be pleased to have our provisions provided for us without earning our provisions. Then he mentions earning a living. Then he goes on to talk about something which is important as well, which we will place focus on, and this is going to become clear when we read the words of Al-Ghazali rahimahullah. He says, and again, we're skipping parts and we're taking parts out. So he says, وَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ الْعَبْدَ فِي حَقِّ دِينِهِ عَلَى ثَلَاثِ دَرَجَاتٍ إما سالم وهو المقتصر على أداء الفرائض وترك المعاصي، أو رابح وهو المتطوع بالقربات والنوافل، أو خاسر وهو المقصر عن اللوازم. So he says, as he's just mentioned now, the acts of worship, seeking knowledge, earning a provision, that a person in regards to his deen is one of three. And you may find a person who is a mixture of these three. In one aspect, he may be of the first category, in another aspect of the third or the second. He says that a person is either safe within his deen, and this is the person who suffices with doing the basic obligatory acts and does not commit sins. And this is actually easier said than done. We very often focus on the acts of worship which are obligatory upon us, but we don't focus on the acts which are prohibited that we should stay away from. And these acts are very, very important for us to understand, i.e. the prohibitions, because prohibitions can destroy a person's deen. For example, and we're going to see inshallah, prohibitions of the tongue, prohibitions of the heart, prohibitions of the private part. A person may be performing their basic obligatory acts, but they are liberally engaging in these prohibitions, and this will lead to destruction in the deen, and eventually it will lead to a person leaving off their compulsory obligatory acts of deen. So we have to be wary of both the obligatory acts and the prohibitions. But he's saying the one who performs the obligatory acts and he stays away from the prohibitions, this person is safe. Even though he may not be doing the voluntary acts, this person is safe. Then he says, the second person, the one who profits, al-rabih. And he says, this is the one who voluntarily performs good deeds and voluntary acts. So he's the one who is doing the basics, he's staying away from the prohibitions, and on top of that, he's doing the voluntary acts. As we said, he's got his capital, and now he's got his investment, so he's going to be making a profit. Then he says, the last one is the loser. This is the one who falls short in his performance of the obligatory acts. Why is he mentioning this here? He says, فَإِن لَمْ تَقْدِرْ أَن تَكُونَ رَابِحًا فَاجْتَهِدْ أَن تَكُونَ سَالِمًا وَإِيَّاكَ ثُمَّ إِيَّاكَ أَن تَكُونَ خَاسِرًا. So he's saying, if you cannot be from those who are profiting, i.e. doing the basics, staying away from the prohibitions, and on top of that doing the voluntary acts, make sure that you are at least being safe. You are at least safe in your deen. You're doing the obligatory acts and you're staying away from the haram. This is the bare minimum. That's the standard that we should not be going below. If we go below that standard, then there is a problem. And if we are to set goals for ourselves, it's very important to set standards. The first standard that we should not go below is that we are performing the obligatory acts and we're staying away from the prohibited acts. And he says, beware of being among the losers. Do not allow yourself to be from the people that are deficient in carrying out their obligatory acts. So why is he mentioning this? Because a person can look at their time, can look at, for example, especially in our time today, they're working for 8 hours a day. They may not have time to seek knowledge. They may not have time to engage in acts of voluntary prayer, but they should make sure they are doing the bare minimum and staying away from the prohibited acts, i.e. the bare minimum in obligatory acts and staying away from the prohibited acts. Then they can focus on making time for seeking knowledge, making time for voluntary prayers if they can. But the bare minimum is the obligatory acts and staying away from the prohibited acts. Then he goes on to discuss some of the etiquettes of the way a person will be with others, and we're not going to go into that in detail, as there will be an entire section of this insha'Allah towards the end of the book. And with that we will end. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين.
ادب مع الله علا وجل بأن تلازم الحياة والذل منكسرا تحت الحياة وخاضعا تحت المهابة إليه ضارعا